Hi, my name is Sarah Briney. Thank you for joining me in a discussion of beginning piano technique. There is a handout linked below for you to follow along if you'd like. This presentation will examine fundamental technical elements that are generally taught during the first 2 or 3 years of piano study. These elements will be examined chronologically in the order the student is generally taught, beginning with posture and bench position, hand and finger position, arm weight and rotation, and finally articulation. While each of these techniques are introduced by the 2nd or 3rd year, they take years to master. My goal in this presentation is to summarize each technical element, examine how leading pedagogues address them, and suggest approaches you can take to best teach these techniques to your beginning piano students. Before we begin, I would like to introduce you to 4 piano methods that I will be referencing during the presentation. The first is Piano Adventures, which was created in 1995 by the husband and wife duo of Randall and Nancy Faber. I will be including the lesson and technique and artistry books from the primer level 1 and level 2. Piano Adventures uses the term secrets for piano technique in the technique books. Each secret is introduced through technical exercises and analogies in the technique. It is intended to be applied by the teacher in the lesson books. There are 8 technique secrets. Good posture is described as the karate pose, with knuckles touching the fallboard. A rounded hand shape is symbolized by blooming flowers or hand cups. Making O's and a finger inspector strategy help with checking for firm fingers. The arm weight analogy is heavy wet ropes. Correct thumb position is described as a thumb perch with a light thumb. A relaxed wrist is created with an imaginary balloon attached to the wrist floating upwards, or a moonwalk. Woodpecker taps are staccato. And finally, finger independence is shown through fast fingers and finger talk. Piano Safari is a method written by Catherine Fisher and Julie Nair in 2018. While studying at the University of Oklahoma, Nair and Fisher met and developed their method. According to Fisher, they had a mutual dream of writing a piano method that would incorporate the best elements of the various techniques they had been using in their writing, close quote. The technical skills are taught through exercises and reinforced with pieces. 8 safari animals are used to represent different technical skills. The first is a lion paw, which represents arm weight, fast repeated notes with a zebra and a kangaroo. Non-legato with an upward bounce is a tall giraffe. A tree frog represents legato articulation with an arm bounce. Nair differentiates between short and long legato patterns using a tree frog and a soaring bird. And finally, rotation is a monkey swinging through the trees. The third method is a dozen a day, which was created by Edna Mae Burnham in 1950. She states, "Many people do exercises every morning before they go to work. Likewise, we should give our fingers exercises every day before we begin our practicing," close quote. The series contains 5 books in total, with the first 2 for the beginning student who is reading on the staff. Each book in the series is made up of 5 groups of 12 exercises. Within the groups, the exercises teach articulation, scale preparation, rotation, relaxation, and arm weight. They are labeled with descriptive words such as skipping, hopping, and deep knee bends. Besides the labels, there is no other instruction. The teacher must determine the technique addressed in each exercise and how to present it to the student. Burnham suggests students learn 2 or 3 exercises each week, which is usually 1 page, mastering and transposing them until all 12 in each group can be played perfectly. The final method is Magic Finger Technique by James Bastian in 1996, who is the creator of the Bastian method. This set has 3 books, 2 of which are beginner. Book 1 should be introduced after the student is reading on the staff. Its objectives include good hand position, independent fingers, equal facility in both hands, and thorough comprehension of all keys. Legato playing is stressed throughout this book, but other touches are also explored, such as staccato, combined articulations, and balance between the hands. Book 2 continues with finger drills in all keys and adds new aspects such as phrasing and slurs. The method has Hanon-like patterns found within a 5-finger hand position. Each pattern is written out in C major, and the student is asked to continue the pattern by transposing through all major keys. On each page, there is a box titled Practice Hints. These hints include how to practice the exercise, reminders to curve fingers, articulation suggestions, wrist positions, and counting out loud. As the patterns get harder, the hints contain more detailed information on how to complete the exercises. Now that I've given us an overview of the methods, let's turn our focus to the fundamental technical elements. So first I will talk about posture and bench position. Beginning with posture, the head must be balanced and the shoulders relaxed. The student should sit directly on the sit bones and tilt forward slightly toward the hips. One way to find this position is to have the student sit on a stool and rock back and forth. Ask the student to locate their sit bones or pelvic bones, then rock forward and backwards so that the sit bones do not touch the bench. This shows the student the best place of balance on the bench. Sitting up is a general term used in piano methods for good posture. When a teacher corrects a student to sit up straight, the student naturally pushes the upper back high and the lower back tightens. Instead, teach the student to sit comfortably without back arch or tension. But how do we do this? Students must feel the difference between when tension is present and absent. Have the student lie down on the floor or sit in a chair. Instruct the student to focus on one body part like the foot. Tense the foot, then release the tension. Another example is the shoulders. Have the student raise their shoulders as high as possible while breathing in. During exhalation, slowly drop the shoulders. For the upper arms and forearms, feel the tension disappear by swinging the arms back and forth and in small circles. Once the entire body is relaxed and posture is established, it is time to address bench position. Bench position includes height and distance from the keyboard. The student should sit facing the middle of the keyboard with both feet on the floor. According to Seymour Bernstein, the length of your torso and arms determine the height. Close quote. He writes in his book, 20 Lessons in Keyboard Choreography, adjust the height of the bench so that the elbow is in line with the keyboard. He explains 3 steps to discover one's height. First, make fists with both hands. Second, silently press C and D an octave above with the right hand and below middle C with the left hand. Then adjust the bench so that the forearms are parallel with the keyboard. Once the student has set the height, find the distance. The length of the arms decides the distance similar to the height. The student's fist should reach the fallboard without leaning forwards or backwards. Keep in mind if a student sits too close to the keyboard, the elbows collide with the body, and by sitting too far away, the student cannot reach the entire keyboard. Now let's see how our 4 methods address the fundamentals of posture and bench height. So 2 of the methods describe height, distance, and good posture. The Faber-Primer lesson book begins with instructions for sitting at the piano. At the first lesson, the student learns to sit at the bench and how to adjust it. For distance, the student's knuckles should reach the fallboard of the piano without leaning forward or backward. In the Technique and Artistry book, this is described as the karate pose, sitting straight and tall in the middle of the bench with arms straight out for distance. For the height, the Faber lesson book suggests sitting on a cushion or a book to raise the student so that the arms are parallel to the keyboard. And finally, the last step is to check the student's back is straight with relaxed shoulders. Piano Safari Level 1 is similar to Faber. Bench position includes sitting on the front of the bench with a footstool if needed. Distance is found by reaching your arms straight out, making fists with your hands, and touching the fallboard of the piano. And the student's forearm should be parallel with the keyboard for height. For posture, the hands and shoulders should be aligned with the top of the spine with relaxed shoulders. These 2 methods mention relaxation and both teach how to find the correct distance and height similarly. Both cover the topic well. The methods a dozen a day and magic fingers are not meant to be used at the beginning of piano study, but a little later and do not cover the topics. Now, once the student learns how to sit, it is time for the student to learn the basics of hand and finger positions. Some guidelines for hand position include a strong bridge, a level wrist, and making sure the hand does not slope towards the 5th finger. There are multiple ways to find and teach the basic piano hand shape. 3 ways are suggested by Leik in his book Creative Piano Teaching. The first is to stand with arms by the side. Raise the arms with relaxed hands and turn the hands face down. The second is to grasp the knees while sitting. Hold this position and raise the hands to the keyboard. The final way is to lay the hands on a flat surface and very gradually draw the fingers towards the palm until the second finger almost touches the thumb. Two of the methods we are considering discuss Handshape. Faber guides the student to notice how the fingers have different lengths in the primer lesson book. By relaxing and making a round C shape, the fingers are magically the same length. The technique and artistry books compare finding the rounded hand position to blooming flowers and hand cups. Blooming flowers is the opposite of like's third way. While like starts with a flat hand, drawing the fingers inward, Faber lets the fingers open like the petals of a flower. Hand cups is the same concept as grasping the kneecaps described by like. Piano Safari simply says to place the hand in a gently curved position with the bridge slightly raised. The fifth finger and thumb should be played on the corners, while the middle fingers are played on the pads, not fingertips. Many students create the bad habit of playing on the side of the fifth finger like a karate chop, rather than the corner. Explain how the fifth finger must stand high and play solidly, going down just like the other fingers. Magic Fingers and A Dozen a Day do not address hand or finger position because they are not meant to be used at the absolute beginning of piano study. Each way I have described can lead to a correct hand position. The C shape, hand cups, and blooming flowers from Faber are good analogies to help the student visualize the concept and find the hand shape easily. Safari gives more detail for what to look for in a hand position. In addition to the hand shape, the fingers must be curved and firm from the beginning of study. Firm fingers do not collapse when playing. Teachers can compare playing from one finger to the next to a person walking. The fingers do not walk and collapse, just like we walk and shift weight between our legs while our knees stay firm. Faber's lesson book introduces firm fingers with a game. There are 6 flashcards with finger numbers written on them, and the student plays the number on the flashcards while applying firm fingertips on the closed lid of the keyboard. After the student learns about firm fingers, the third finger is braced by the thumb, and the student plays each note from middle C, higher than lower on the keyboard. The technique books also introduce 2 secrets for building up firm fingers, making O's and finger inspector. In making O's, the student presses each finger against the tip of the thumb to make the shape of an O. This exercise draws the student attention to the instability of their finger joints and helps strengthen the joints. For finger inspector, the student places their hand on the closed keyboard and uses the other hand to press down on each fingernail, keeping firm fingertips. Piano Safari also addresses how the fingers should be firm in a good hand position. They eventually reinforce it in the technique exercises throughout the book with reminders of firm fingers. Magic Fingers mentions curved fingers in many of their hint boxes at the top of exercises, and A Dozen a Day does not mention fingers. The last appendage I want to talk about is the thumb. Many people do not realize that it is made up of 3 joints. Because of its shortness, there are 2 ways to use it. The first is on the first joint, or the tip of the thumb, and this is used on the white keys. The second is when playing the black keys. The student should point the first joint away from the palm when playing a black key. The 5th secret in the technique primer of Faber addresses correct thumb position. The thumb should play on the side tip of the fingernail by perching, while the other finger should rest gently on the keys. Piano Safari addresses thumb position by stating the thumb is to be played on the corner. Magic Fingers and Dozen a Day do not address the topic. Both methods, Faber and Piano Safari, teach thumb position well. Next, we will consider 5-finger patterns and scales. 5-finger patterns are taught to early beginners with the goal of building an even, full tone. Robert Pace gives an explanation of how to play them in his book, Way to Play Them. He states, let the weight of your arm shift from one finger to the next. Make a slow circular motion with your wrist as you play from the bottom note back to the top, close quote. Play with a relaxed wrist, no bounce, and firm fingers. Faber introduces 5-finger patterns, first in the key of C. Faber states in the primer level, "In music, a scale is like a set of stairs that steps up or down from one key to the next," close quote. The student learns the song C-D-E-F-G March, which is a C 5-finger pattern performed hand separately. It is not until level 2A that Faber introduces a formal 5-finger pattern exercise in the Technique and Artistry book. The student learns the pattern in C major, hands together, in parallel motion while applying the techniques. Piano Safari Level 2 opens with a piece utilizing the tree frog articulation, legato with an arm bounce on each note, and a 5-finger pattern played in parallel motion. The piece is a C major 5-finger pattern on half notes followed by a broken triad. The student is reminded to connect their fingers with the tree frog articulation, to have firm fingertips and a relaxed thumb. Along with C major, the student also learns the keys G, D, and A. Following the tree frog, grasshoppers appear for staccato articulation. The student learns a C major 5-finger pattern with this articulation, hands separately and hands together. Something different Piano Safari uses is the kangaroo rhythm and motion. Bouncy arms, loose wrists, and firm fingertips are used with repeated notes in the rhythm of 2/8 notes and 1/4 note to outline the word kangaroo. In Piano Safari, 5-finger patterns are used for introduction to keys, for articulation, and for finger independence. A Dozen a Day's first 5-finger scale uses contrary motion with non-legato articulation. The goal of each of the exercises is to play with firm fingers and strong hands. In the mini-book, it is titled as Arms Flaining Out and Back. The student plays hands together, starting on middle C, and stops on the 4th fingers. They gradually work up to all 5 notes in stretching legs out and back. Eventually, the method uses 5-finger patterns in parallel motion, legato and staccato articulation, hands together. Bastian's Magic Fingers book begins with 5-finger patterns in parallel motion, hands separately, then together to teach finger independence. This book moves the student through the keys grammatically in each exercise. The goal is to play in all keys with curved fingers and a legato touch. The 4 methods introduce 5-finger patterns differently using parallel motion, contrary motions, and various articulations. The best way to start 5-finger patterns is to teach the student how to play them in contrary motion, as in A Dozen a Day. This develops arm weight and rotation moving outward. Next, teach hands separately and together in parallel motion to develop finger independence, as well as opposing circular motion between the hands. The hand and leg exercises found in Magic Finger are perfect for teaching this skill thoroughly and in all keys. Finally, teach students to play 5-finger patterns with different articulations as they learn them. For instance, non-legato, legato, staccato, and 2-note slurs. Safari does this very well with the specific animals as creative reference points. 5-finger patterns work toward learning arm weight, rotation, firm fingers, new keys, practicing articulations, and build towards playing the octave scale. Scales in their full form have long been a staple of technical skills performed by all pianists. The goal for scale playing is to develop the ability to produce and control different sounds. The best way to teach them under techniques is by teaching hands together scales. Like has 3 approaches. In one approach, the thumb tucks itself under the hand immediately after playing and stays behind the other fingers until played again. The second is to keep the thumb relaxed and ready until needed. The thumb should hang near the second finger and move slightly to play while the elbow turns the hand out of the way. A third approach is the rocking motion or rotation of the forearm to prepare the thumb to play. In this case, the fingers turn the arm using rotation. Bernstein suggests using rotation in scale playing. He applies the same rules to scales as 5-finger patterns. Pianists rotate their hand towards their body while playing the thumb, and away when playing the 5th finger. The 2nd, 3rd, and 4th fingers rotate in the direction of the next scale pitch. And when the thumb tucks under, it strikes vertically, and the wrist passes over. As you can see, there are many views on how to play a scale correctly, and how teachers should introduce scales. The Faber method does not introduce full scales in the first 3 books. Instead, it focuses on simple 5-finger patterns, chords, and arpeggios. In the Level 2A technique book, Faber introduces thumb under technique with the chromatic scale. While exploring half steps, the student learns chromatic scale fingering of fingers 1 and 3. While this is helpful for learning thumb under techniques, it does not build towards the octave scale as the second finger is skipped. Piano Safari has multiple exercises for thumb under techniques. They use the snake to represent the scale. The first scale snake is a 2-octave C major scale using only fingers 1 and 2. While going up, the thumb passes under finger 2, and coming down, finger 2 passes over the thumb. Using the same pattern, it adds fingers 3 and 4. The scale is played with a legato touch and relaxed fingers. These exercises are helpful to a younger student or one who has trouble understanding how to tuck their thumb under or the 3rd or 4th fingers over. A Dozen a Day introduces scales in a similar way. It begins with an exercise of tucking the thumb under after playing the 3rd finger and immediately returning the 3rd finger to the previous note. It then teaches the student to put the thumb under and bring the entire hand over. In one exercise, the left hand begins with the thumb on C, plays down to the 3rd finger, crosses the thumb under on G, and brings the hand over to play the finger 5 on the lower C. This is helpful for the student who tends to use incorrect fingering for the last 5 notes of a scale, or for the student who is moving from 5-finger patterns to an octave scale. The series does not introduce a full hands together scale in the first 2 books. Magic Fingers introduces thumb and finger over techniques with 2 exercises and the chromatic scale. In Book 1, there are 2 exercises. One is a pentascale on white keys that only uses fingers 1 and 2. The other pattern stays between C and E, moving between the 3 notes with fingers 1 and 2. Overall, A Dozen a Day is the most thorough in building the thumb under technique because of the many different exercises it presents before the full scale is introduced. Safari does a good job helping students to realize the thumb can go under fingers 2, 3, or 4. And Magic Fingers and Faber both take chromatic and straight octave scale approaches, which are good for older students. The third category of fundamental technical elements is arm weight and rotation. Arm weight is a technique used for both chords and single notes. The sound is effectively produced through gravity and energy by dropping the hand freely on the keyboard. The hand, wrist, elbows, and shoulders absorb the impact. Once the keys are played, the rebound releases the tension and pressure on the fingertips. In her dissertation, Strategies in the Formation of Piano Technique, Julie Nair states that the impulse begins at the feet, travels through the body, and ends at the strings, with the fingers staying as close to the keys as possible, close quote. The muscles should release once the notes sound. Here are some exercises to experience tension and release. One exercise is to have the student place their right arm on the left arm. The left arm holds up the weight of the right, eventually release the pressure of the right arm, and the left arm will drop. Next, the student transfers this process onto 2 notes of the keyboard. After learning to drop the weight onto the key, the student must learn how to release the weight. Once a key is played, there is no need to exert any more weight because there is no more effect on the sound. Here is an exercise to experience release. Drop the weight of your arm onto the student's arm. Once your hand falls onto their arm, release the pressure. This releases the tension in the arm and hand. And this demonstration allows the student to feel the pressure and release. In the Faber method, arm weight is a technique secret called heavy wet ropes. In slow motion, students raise their arms up with a feeling of heaviness and let the arms drop completely relaxed into the lap. Piano Safari Level 1 uses a heavy lion's paw to represent the weight. The exercise in the book is to play each white note with a heavy and loose arm, pretending it is a lion's paw. The student learns in Level 2 how to apply the lion's paw to blocked triads. A Dozen a Day uses the analogy of deep breathing to represent arm weight. Exercises of deep breathing begin with thirds, then move to blocked and broken chords. Students should drop the weight of their arm into the blocked intervals. Magic Fingers does not mention arm weight and only has one exercise in Book 1 with blocked chords. To teach arm weight, teachers should use an analogy to describe it, such as the lion paw or heavy wet ribs. This is a complex concept, and young students will benefit from a visual representation of it. Then use pressure and release exercises to help the student experience the feeling and trying it. Finally, have the student apply the technique on single notes, building up to blocked chords. It is explained well in all the methods we are examining except for Magic Fingers, although the teacher will need to explain it thoroughly and help the student experience the tension and release through exercises. Arm weight also applies to forearm rotation, which uses the technique of shifting arm weight between each note. Forearm rotation imitates the motion a hand makes when turning a doorknob, moving between the thumb and fifth finger sides. The forearm, wrist, and hand move together from the elbow while the upper arm remains stationary. Here are two examples of rotation away from the keyboard. The first is to hold an imaginary key and pretend to insert a key into a lock and turn. The second exercise is to rest the hands on a flat surface. Release arm weight onto the fifth fingers while rolling the thumbs up and away from the body. Faber does not include a technique secret for rotation, but Piano Safari does. They use a monkey swinging in a tree for rotation. The student learns to transfer arm weight with broken thirds. The hand must be up over the keys with strong fingertips and a relaxed thumb. In level 2, the technique is applied to fifths and thirds hands together. A Dozen a Day also teaches rotation with thirds in the same way as Safari in the mini-book. In the third book, Wide Walk Stiff-Legged shows the analogy of someone waddling with stiff legs as the notes rotate between C and G in each hand. Another analogy Dozen a Day uses is rocking. In the preparatory book, the right hand rocks between the third and fifth fingers, while the left hand rocks between the thumb and fourth fingers. Finally, cross-hand arpeggios are frequently used throughout the two books. First hands separately, then in parallel and contrary motion, then hands together. Magic Fingers also provides opportunities for rotation through cross-hand arpeggios. Cross-hand arpeggios are introduced in all keys with a wrist roll, moving arm weight from one note to the next. As you can see, there are multiple ways to teach rotation. The monkey swinging between the trees is a fun analogy for the student who enjoys animals and imagination. The waddling between stiff legs in A Dozen a Day is helpful for the kinesthetic student. Have the student waddle around or lean from side to side to experience the transfer of weight and wrist rotation. Teach rotation between thirds and fifths first, then add other patterns such as cross-hand arpeggios and five-finger patterns as seen in A Dozen a Day and Magic Fingers. Rotation is not only important for specific patterns, but for playing with legato articulation as well. The fourth topic is articulation, specifically legato, non-legato, two-note slurs, and staccato. Legato is the connection of notes through sound and combines the techniques of rotation and arm weight. First, a student must learn how to sustain sound properly. Some students tend to connect pitches as individual notes rather than in a group of notes. The first challenge is to teach the student not to grab the key while trying to sustain sound. Instead, the hand must release the tension and tightness as soon as the key is played. Teach the student to understand how one key goes down while another goes up. Jinhua Chon describes the action as that of a seesaw in her dissertation, Mind, Body, and Piano, a synergistic approach to teaching pianos to beginners. Begin with two-note exercises between the hands, move to two notes in one hand, then add three notes, etc. Remind the student to keep firm fingers with a relaxed wrist while channeling the energy into the keys. This will lead to a fluidity of sound while maintaining a relaxed hand. To aid in the legato sound, Bernstein connects rotation with the legato articulation. He says, play two notes separately, release the first as soon as the second note sounds. Begin again and tilt the bridge of the hand towards the second note. This will cause the finger on the first note to rise. Bernstein says the slower you lift the first key, the more the first sound will overlap into the second sound, producing extreme legato, close quote. Use forearm rotation to help the fingers connect. An aspect of legato are two-note slurs. To play a two-note slur, drop the hand onto the first note, use the principles of rotation and fluidity from legato playing, and add a wrist lift on the second note. The first note is played louder than the second one. Non-legato is how most beginners play, and the student should merely drop the hand onto each note, pause for a moment, and lift to create a slight break between the notes. Legato articulation can be approached in different ways. Faber teaches legato and lifts at the same time. Piano Safari teaches lifts along with a non-legato articulation before legato. A Dozen a Day introduces legato, staccato, and two-note slurs in a sequence at the same time, while Magic Fingers teaches legato well before introducing two-note slurs and lifts. Let's look more closely at each method's approach. Level 1 of the Faber method covers topics of articulation. Beginning with slurs, Level 1 explains the articulation of legato by connecting notes with no break in the sound. Faber applies the analogy of walking. One foot comes down, the other foot comes up, yet both feet never leave the ground at the same time. Little River is the first piece with legato and contains two long slurs with wrist float-offs. The wrist float-off is explained in the Technique and Artistry book with the technique secret of a relaxed wrist. Set the hands in a rounded position. Pretend a balloon is attached to the wrist by a string. The balloon pulls the wrist upward, letting the wrist rise until only the tip of finger 3 is touching the key. Then gently return to a playing position. At the end of each slur in the exercises and pieces, the book has either the words wrist lift off or a U shape with an arrow to show the lift. These two techniques shape the two-note slur. To play the slur, the wrist drops onto the first note, uses the legato forearm rotation, and lifts at the end of the second note. The last note is usually softer than the first. Piano Safari introduces wrist lifts before legato and has two animals representing legato. Towards the beginning of Level 1, the tall giraffe shows the student a non-legato touch with a lift. To picture this movement, the giraffe begins at the top of a hill, walks down, eats, and walks back up. Using this motion, the wrist drops down onto the note, stays for a moment, then lifts. The wrist is lifted at the end of every half note in the piece. Following the tall giraffe, the tree frog is the first animal in the book representing legato articulation. It has a similar technique to the tall giraffe, except with a legato touch. Lifts are applied at the end of each slur, similar to the tall giraffe. The method reminds the student to play with firm fingertips, connecting notes with a slight arm bounce on each note, and a graceful lift at the end of the slurs. The second animal representing legato technique is the soaring bird, which is legato under one arm motion rather than the tree frog that used multiple motions. The piece regarding the soaring bird uses 3 upward moving notes in steps. The student incorporates a smooth down-up motion of the arm with a graceful arch moving up the keyboard. A Dozen a Day is genius when teaching two-note slurs. The mini-book begins with walking between the notes of C and D. This teaches the student legato. In the next exercise, the student learns to hop on each note for staccato. And finally, the third and fourth exercises combine the two. The right-hand thumb drops onto C, connects with a slur C to D, and lifts on a staccato D. Similarly, the left hand drops onto C, connects to B, and lifts. Magic Fingers merely states to play legato on all exercises in Book 1, although the teacher could easily incorporate non-legato and staccato as the student is ready. Book 2 introduces slurs and two-note slurs. Two-note slurs are in the first exercise called Bouncing the Ball. The practice hints box describes how to play the slur. First, drop on the first note with a low wrist position, then lift at the end of the second note with a high wrist position. Say the words up-down as the student plays. The exercise contains intervals of fifths and thirds. A combination of these methods is best. First, teach the student lifts through a non-legato touch, such as Piano Safari. Second, teach arm weight and rotation between the two notes. Third, teach two-note slurs with arm weight, rotation, and a lift on the end. With the arm weight and rotation, draw attention to the loud and soft aspect. And finally, teach legato touch through longer phrases or five-finger patterns with lifts at the end. Speed of the fingers, rotation, and touch affect the length of notes, whether long or short. Proper staccato articulation is frequently difficult to grasp for beginners. It requires relaxed hands and arms, firm fingertips, and quick motions. The Level 1 Faber technique book uses an animal analogy to teach staccato playing. The technique secret is a light hand bounce, which is played as woodpecker taps. First, place the right hand in a rounded hand position. Perch the thumb on the side tip, checking that the wrist does not sag. Finally, lightly tap a rhythm with the fingertips. Switch and repeat with left hand. Staccato is explained as the opposite of legato in the lesson book. Staccato is, according to Faber, to separate the notes to create a crisp, detached sound, close quote. The student practices staccato articulation with a braced third finger and plays a five-finger pattern with the articulation. Piano Safari teaches staccato through grasshoppers. The student learns a C major five-finger pattern with staccato articulation, hands separately and hands together. A Dozen a Day also combines articulations as mentioned above with two-note slurs and describes staccato articulation as hopping, usually on one foot. This analogy is helpful for students rather than the typical "the key is hopped" analogy. Instead, hopping reminds the student that the finger has to return back to the ground. Magic Fingers introduces staccato articulation in Book 2. The practice hence describes staccato as short and detached. The exercises are meant to be played legato, then staccato, and then with one hand legato, the other staccato. These exercises are basic five-finger patterns, no double notes or chords. Of the four methods, Dozen a Day does a nice job on the analogy of hopping for staccato and presenting exercises for practice. Faber's woodpecker tap is also a good analogy, and Piano Safari's grasshopper exercises are a good place to start when presenting staccato to a student. In conclusion, here are what I consider the best ways to teach basic technique principles to beginning piano students based on my research. These include posture and bench position, hand and finger position, five-finger patterns and scales, weight and rotation, and articulations. Technique basics begin with good posture at and away from the piano. Sitting properly not only includes sitting tall, but also relaxed with proper breathing. Determining bench position is important. Height and distance depends on the student, their torso, and length of arms. The Faber method and Piano Safari both suggest the correct distance is the student's arm length to the fallboard of the piano. The arm should be parallel to the keyboard to determine the height. The hand and finger positions include a strong bridge, firm fingers, and level wrist. There are multiple ways to find the correct hand position, from the blooming flowers of Faber to simply turning one's hands over as suggested by Like. The fingers must then be taught to play with firmness. Bracing the fingers or completing O exercises from Faber are excellent ways to teach the feeling of firmness. Firm fingers aid in performing five-finger patterns with a full, even tone that will eventually build up to the thumb under octave scales. A Dozen a Day has different exercises to develop thumb under technique, and Piano Safari's snake scales are good for practicing thumb under with different fingers. Arm weight is produced through gravity and energy. Through demonstration, the student should experience arm weight through pressure and release on the arm. Faber describes arm weight as heavy wet ropes. Piano Safari uses a lion paw, and A Dozen a Day talks about deep breathing and deep knee bends. Forearm rotation teaches the student to transfer their arm weight between fingers while building the legato touch. This is done best by utilizing broken thirds and fifths as done by all the methods. Piano Safari's monkey swinging in the trees is a nice touch to describe rotation creatively. Finally, I talked about legato and staccato articulations. For legato technique, use rotation and explain that the slower you lift the key, the more the first sound will overlap with the other. Staccato articulation requires relaxed hands and arms, firm fingers, and quick motions. You can use Faber's analogy of woodpecker taps, Safari's grasshoppers, or the hopping in Dozen a Day to help the student visualize the articulation. In the book, The Story of Philosophy, Will Durant wrote, "We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. Instill excellence in technique early so that it will become a habit in your students." The sources listed below are also found in the handout. Thank you for watching.